Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome back. Thank you for attending Moving into Action in Conversation with Dominic Carter and our host, Dom Scott. Before we get started, we do need to go over some general housekeeping. If you have any questions throughout the session, please do put them in the chat box under Q&A to your right, and Dominic will provide practical answers at the end. The session will be recorded and made available on demand on the BYP Network conference site. I will now hand over to Dominic Carter, CCO at News UK, and our fabulous host, Dom Scott, Managing Director at Alexander Hall. Welcome, Dom and Dom. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Ruth. So hello once again and welcome to the Moving into Action session. I'm your host, Dom Scott, and joining me, we have a real treat for you. We've got Dominic Carter, who is the Group Chief Commercial Officer at News UK. And he is the most senior Black executive and one of the most senior people, in fact, working in media in the UK. And I want to use this opportunity to discuss how a leader like Dominic creates change in his organization with a particular focus on D&I programs and what's happening within News UK at this point in time. So Dominic, welcome. How are you?
Thank you. I'm feeling good, although I didn't get the fabulous put in front of my name. The fabulous Dom Scott and Dominic Carter from News UK. I'm not too bad, actually.
I have a feeling you will do once this session is finished. So first of all, let's provide some context for our listeners. I'm really keen to get an insight into your personal journey and how that leads into your career journey before we get into talking about News UK.
Well, I mean, it depends how far back you want to go. I was born in the northeast of England. I'm not a Londoner. The media industry, as you know, is centred in London, so already sure. I'm an outsider.
Where in the northeast are you from?
Oh, you wouldn't even heard of it. Redcar. Redcar in the northeast. So if you know about horse racing, you'll know that there's a Redcar race course, and sure. When I was born there, and apart from that, there's amusement arcades. And I was born there, but I spent the first sort of 9.5 years of my life living in Nigeria, and fortunately or unfortunately, whichever way you look at it, I was then put in boarding school in the UK, and spent my holidays going back to Nigeria, but most of my formative years spent in the northeast of England at boarding school.
Okay, and talk to us a bit about your journey through the media industry. What initially attracted you to it, or did you just fall into it by accident?
I think the thing that most of us do in this part of the industry is we tend to fall into it. I don't think any of us wake up in the morning and think that's I'm going to go and sell ads.
But fall in love with it.
You fall in love with it because it's an incredible industry. You get to meet a lot of different people. You get to learn a lot about a lot of different industries, a lot of different clients. You get to meet CEOs from all over. You get to meet politicians. So I think it's quite a stimulating industry for all of those reasons. But it's also quite a fun industry because it's a very social industry. So most of us that join it end up staying in it. But I got into it by I guess fairly fortunately in terms of I started off in magazines, and I happened to know a journalist that was in magazines, an old school friend of mine, and I got an interview with the MD and got the job and got promoted 6 months later. Launched a magazine 18 months after that for another company, and then I stepped out of that and decided I wanted to work in newspapers, which in those days were pretty much the major media out there. Apart from that,
when you're saying those days, I'm just trying to get.
Now you're going to try and reveal my age.
How far back are we going?
So put it this way: I left school in the mid '80s. So I joined magazines in the late '80s. I joined newspapers in 1991. So that's when I first came into major. I guess you'd argue it was major media. And it still is, but obviously the role that I do now is a bit broader than just newspapers. I've got TV coming, and obviously I run radio as well. So
I mean, it's potentially a whole nother session because the title of this session isn't Trailblazers, but you think back to the newspaper industry at that time, it didn't have a great relationship with the Black community. So for somebody like yourself to want to go into it, it's a really courageous decision, and no doubt. We've all benefited from you being there.
I wouldn't say courageous decision, although maybe because I think if you And it's one of the things that we identified when we put a whole strategy in this was the barrier to entry. For most of us that look like me and you, the media isn't the automatic place that you think you're going to be welcomed in. And the reality is that I was told I would never get a job in newspapers because I didn't have any experience in newspapers. I didn't know anybody, and it was who you knew.
Yeah.
And in those days, they didn't advertise, so so it literally was who you knew. I just decided to write to all the MDs of all the national newspapers. I got four job offers in 1 week, and I chose the one at the Sun, and I started working at the Sun. And I spent the first 3 months of my life telling all my friends I won't be here for long. I really wanted to join the Times. So yeah, but then you learn to love the Sun as well, and for all its foibles and for all of its misconceptions and perceptions and negative perceptions of the product, the actual intention is quite well-meaning. But back in those days, yeah, it wasn't a particular welcome place. And my local barber at the time in Shepherd's Bush used to say to me, one day I'm going to write the Sun on the back of your hair and they're going to kick your ass when you walk down the street. So I got a sense of what I was working for.
I mean, my frame of reference is when you think back to the New Crossfire and the day of action, and there was a march going down Fleet Street, and how people, let's just say, who were employees of various newspapers treated that crowd sort of from the windows. That sort of paints a picture as to what the culture may have been like. So I'm really intrigued to get a sense of what it was like then, and sort of a snapshot of how it compares to now.
Well, just to put it in a bit of context, another friend of mine that did work on the Times, worked in classified, and there's the two differentials between what you did in sales in those days. You were either in display sales, which meant you went to see clients, you were allowed out of the building, or in classified sales where you literally were on the phone all day. This friend of mine had tried to get into display sales the year earlier, didn't get the job. What he didn't know was, as I found out shortly after I joined, was the reason was the MD at the time had said, we're not having a black person working in display. This was pretty common currency around the media industry. You didn't see any account directors in agencies that also fronted clients. You never saw a black face there either, because they didn't look like the clients, and therefore you surely couldn't have a black person in front of them. So that was the context of the environment that I guess I joined into. It's it's moved quite a lot since then.
So what were your roles within was it News UK back then? You said you were working
News International.
News International. So how did your career journey progress?
Actually went quite well. I mean, I think the reality is that when you're in a business, if you're doing a good job, people just accept you for what you are, and that's the reality. I was the fastest promotion from sales exec to first line of management. I was the first person in the company ever to be sent internationally, so I went to Australia with the organisation for 4 months. I moved around the organisation. I'd worked on every single newspaper that we owned at the time, and worked internationally with the company. So my career progressed pretty rapidly, and I was well connected through. I just always saw it as an opportunity. You got to know what you got to do. To get on the business, you've got to be great at your job, but you've got to make sure that you're connected with those around you as well that can influence your career, which is basically your colleagues as much as it is your bosses, because your colleagues ultimately push you up, and your bosses pull you up. So I managed to build quite a good career in my initial phase, and I say my initial phase because I left after 9 years.
Sure. So the theme of the conference is all about collaboration, and what you've touched on there is, you were not a one-man army sort of doing this on your own. You had a network of people around you. You were collaborating. So can you touch on that? Can you expand on that? I'm keen to get some
from a career point of view.
Sponsors, in terms of sponsors or mentors. How did that unfold for you?
Yeah, I think you stand out because you're good at what you do. If that's really the only way you really stand out is to be really good at what you do. I had a benefit in a way of being the colour that I am, and I did use it to my advantage, because I knew all of my customers, would be of a certain look, and when I was to phone up and make an appointment with someone and go and see them, even if I was the only person in reception, someone would come out and look around and go, Dominic Carter? Yeah, yes, that's me, and immediately on the back foot, and I capitalised on that.
So you get a sense then you're saying actually being one of, or even the only black person there, you're drawing attention to yourself, but then it's how you use that attention, which was of benefit to you.
Yeah, and that's the key. I think I knew I would stand out, and I knew I'd be remembered, but not remembered just for my colour, but remembered because I was good at what I do. So I had to work hard, and I think that's really important that everyone has to recognise that, nothing comes easy for anybody. It doesn't matter what colour you are, but where you have an advantage, which is a point of difference. Difference can be a really positive thing, and in most cases, if you take that positive mental attitude and assume that you can use it positively, then you will build a career for yourself. But
Sure.
you have to be good at what you do too. So
I'm just looking at the chat here, and Ruth has written the incredible Dominic Carter. So just listening to this story,
yeah, that was a good cartoon.
It most certainly is the case. So just touch on sort of sponsorship and mentors. I'm just keen to understand if you benefited from either of these things, which are just so commonplace now, but going back to the 90s, the 80s, maybe not so.
Yeah, I did build a good relationship with with one of the general managers, who then became the MD, and that was really positive for me because that person pulled me through the organization, probably for about 5 or 6 years of my career. And I mentioned that I left the company after 9 years. I came back 7 years later, and that same person was the person that brought me back into the company in a more senior role. And then the rest is it was actually a whole other set of connections that I made with James Murdoch and et cetera, that pulled me through the rest of to where I am today.
Sure. So when we last spoke, I have to say I was really blown away by how busy you've been at News UK in terms of creating change and how much activity you've generated. And before we talk about that, I'm keen to understand what's motivated you to be as active as you have been.
A lot of it rests in what I've just talked about a little bit about where I started from and this industry, this notion that you had to know someone to get a job, which I dispelled by writing a letter, not believing that to be the case, that I think I was good enough to get a job, irrespective of the fact that I didn't know anyone. So the other bit about it was the story about the friend of mine on that was working in classified that wouldn't get a job because they wouldn't have a black person in display. And this is going back a long time ago. So, but when your start point of your career is framed by that, and then I have a couple of other friends in the industry, that would tell similar stories on the agency side, that that there's a point in time where you've got to get to a position where you get the opportunity to influence it. Now, it's not just about the position; it's about the climate of everything else that's going on around you. And so I was motivated by all the way through my career to be brilliant at what I did, if I could be, and to be known for being brilliant at what I do, and to get myself up the structure so that other people of my, that look like me could see it can be done, and that would be the first point. So that was partly driven by that. I want to show that it can be done.
Okay. And you also alluded to the tragic murder of George Floyd last year and how that really accelerated your desire to create change and implement initiatives.
Yeah. So, and I mentioned to you before, about 18 months before that. So we do a thing called News Union, which is our own internal union for our printers and staff more generally. And we have a conference every year. We did a News Union conference where people like me and the rest of the exec will stand up and talk about the business. And someone, woman called Claudette, not a senior person, one of the union members, union reps, put a hand up to ask a question. And the question was the view, what's the view of the exec about our position with regards to diversity, ethnic diversity in the company? And that is what lit the fire in the first place, I guess. And I thought, the right question, and a brilliant question, and that started it. 18 months later.
Is she a black woman, you said?
She's a black woman. Yeah.
Just put this into context, this is a company meeting. All the execs are on the stage, is that right? And the audience can essentially challenge them on any aspect of the business. Yeah. This woman stood up. And what was the question she posed?
What's the company's view on our ethnic diversity?
Okay.
And that was to all the exec, but it wasn't a challenge. It was just a question. But it was a question that, and it wasn't to me, it was to the CEO, it was to Rebecca. Okay. And I think it's a moment of reflection, and it was a moment of reflection for everybody. And I ended up answering the question, and I said, what I think you're asking, Claudette, is what are we going to do about our ethnic diversity in the organization? And I think it's a totally valid and well-timed question.
I just got this image of everyone being unsure what to say, then all the execs' eyes just turn to you.
It's always that way. That's the reality. So, and then Rebecca also joined in with, it is something that we know we need to look at. And so that started it. And the conversation went from there. And then obviously the murder of George Floyd accelerated everything. Yes. And that's what really started to change. And the part of the reason why that changed is because of the age of many of us, we've got teenage children and their friends, and and what we saw and what we heard, and probably, I mean, me included, was from the teenagers that really understood it and understood the lack of fairness. And it doesn't matter whether you're black or Caucasian, pretty much every parent I know was getting a lot of this. The media may have some responsibility for this, in the way they portray it, but society is not fair anyway. And and social media is a benefit to that, because they can research a lot more, but they were definitely asking the question, and and so were people in the business.
Well, there was a sense of collective introspection, and it created so much discourse. And I feel like that momentum is still there, but if we're not careful, it can dissipate and we go back to square one. So it's important we keep talking, but right in sync with this session is then how do we turn that conversation into action? So I'm really keen to understand how you then approach the CEO and created some change within News UK.
So there's a couple of different things that happened, but I think the first instance was the pace at which we did it and the desire not to do it externally. Okay. The whole point was that our start point was we've got to fix ourselves, before we talk about anything externally, and about what we're doing. And I thought that was good, because this is not virtue signaling. It was a genuine intent, to change the business that we're in. And, so that was my start point, because if someone had said to me, we just want to do this and we want to market the fact that we're doing this, then I would have said it's not the right thing to do. Okay. And my heart wouldn't have been in it. So that was that was the start point. And then what we did, we have these senior management meetings with top 250. And I got various different speakers in, from June Sarpong to Karen Blackett, who's a country manager at WPP, just to start the conversation.
Yeah. Would you call that thought leadership? Did you feel as though there were people that wanted to make a difference but didn't really have the language, didn't really have the concepts?
Yeah, and it was correct. And it was also to hear their journey, and to also enlighten people to think a little bit. Like June's very much about check your circle, check, who are the last 10 people you called? What do they look like? Where are they from? And if you don't know anyone that looks like us, then you possibly don't, necessarily understand and appreciate the differences and the cultural differences. And therefore, if you can't see them in your circle, then you need to, find a way to bring them into your circle.
It sounds like you had an open door for this kind of conversation, but nevertheless, if there's someone listening who wants to have the same sort of conversation with their senior leadership team, what nugget of advice would you give?
So, I referred back to that News Union. It's a question. I mean, the start point, always the question. The question provokes the thinking, and the thinking turns into action. And, and all of these things have just happened really from all the way back then, to then starting to get people to understand, which is what we did, and then form groups. And and the groups that we are all fine, whether it's parents at News, whether it's the Cultural Diversity Network, which is for the BAME group, the Christian Fellowship group, etc. We've set up a whole host of groups, and those groups were encouraged to set up, not we're going to do this, who wants to volunteer to join. It was, we need representation around this business, from Gen Z to LGBTQ+ to to people of ethnic background, ethnic minorities, to gender, because gender is a big part of our balance we want in the company. And all the groups were then set up, voluntarily, as a result, as a result of me setting up the diversity board across the company. All those groups were then encouraged to set up, and they got together, and we started a dialogue. And the dialogue was a thing that drove strategy, and the strategy is a thing that is now in play and changing the business.
Okay, so let's talk about the diversity board and the cultural diversity network. That was one of the outcomes from the strategic agenda. Yeah. What are they? How do they work?
So, so the diversity board is, so I chair it, but I have representation from all parts of the business, from our radio businesses, from our editorial departments, from various other departments, marketing, et cetera, around the company. So we have about 14 members on the diversity board, because what we try to do is to set up around 3 pillars about attracting talent and retaining talent. This is about ethnic, about diverse talent, from changing the products, because the products are basically the marketing thing. It's what people see, and if they don't feel like go back to where I started, if it doesn't feel like an industry you can join, because we vilify in the front of the paper, if you like, and we, celebrate in the back, then, so how do we find balance? How do we make sure that we're doing it the right way as a product, and then bringing in more diversity, which is a recruitment pillar, which was more about apprenticeships and internships. So bringing people from communities that wouldn't ordinarily think of us, and getting them young and getting them to spend time in our organization, and then taking them on as apprenticeships. So they're the 3 things that we've enabled.
And you said something really fascinating when we spoke previously, when you compared the statistics of people who were from the talent pool you usually recruit from versus the talent pools you don't usually recruit from.
Yeah, so one of the things that we did quite early on, and it's not a government requirement, but in the same way you have a gender pay gap, we wanted to measure 2 things: the ethnicity of the population, the diversity of the population, which was ethnicity, sexual diversity, religion. And so we did a questionnaire around the company. We didn't get the results that we wanted in the first instance, in terms of it wasn't statistically robust enough to use, but we pushed on with it, and we got through about 74% of the company that have now responded, and everybody that now joins the company does that. So we understood the makeup of the business, and that was the first start point, and that included where you were educated and where your parents were educated, and what your parents' role was. And what we saw was that a majority of people, and this was more prevalent in some areas than others, that was most people were from middle class backgrounds, where their parents were doctors, lawyers, or whatever. A disproportionate amount. I think the average, the national average is about 6% of people go to private school. We're at about 16%, and and that was in our editorial department, so our journalists. And we're a predominantly Caucasian organisation. So, and once you've got those stats, then we start to look at ethnicity pay gap as well. And actually, our ethnicity pay gap isn't that bad, but the problem is we just don't have enough ethnicity. So they all became targets that we set as an organisation.
Okay, and in terms of performance, when you look at individuals from different groups or demographics, how are people performing and progressing?
Yeah, so that's one of the core pillars, was about retention, and because one of the things that we do is we're getting a lot more ethnicity into the business, but we were losing more than we were getting in. So therefore we set up we've set up specific training for people from diverse backgrounds, so that we retain them. So that was the key thing. And I think the point that you were referencing earlier was about what we've done with apprenticeships. So when we generally, if you looked at parts of our business, when we do graduate intakes, which is what we used to do in the Times, we do graduate intakes, but there were, the reality is, when you, and this is about conscious and unconscious bias. When you do graduate intake and you went to Russell Group University, you're most likely going to look for someone that went to Russell Group University. And if it's someone that went to private school and you're from private school, you're most likely going to look for someone that goes from private school. And this is what we were finding, that we were perpetuating the same thing, which is not, cognitive diversity is as important as ethnic diversity. And if you're to bring it in from people from look like you, sound like you, educated like you're not going to get much of that, and it doesn't improve business. So one of the first things we did was to try and change that to having CVs where we we for the first time in the last intake we took on the graduates where we didn't have the names in their backgrounds. We just looked at what they did, and then we asked them to do work. And this became even more important when we took the apprentices on, because we just didn't have any CVs. We just asked them. Well, we had CVs, but we didn't. For the people that were judging on the performance of those individuals that had applied for the apprenticeships, we asked them to do a piece of work. We gave them a project. And overwhelmingly, what came through was, and it was surprising, and I will say it was surprising, was that the ethnically diverse people, and also those from a different economic background, were the ones that came through as the strongest candidates. And I say it was surprising because it was surprising to those that were doing the interviews. So, whereas, to be frank,
well, internally, absolutely, it must be surprising, because you have a status quo and an entrenched way of doing things, and chances are you've been doing it for a very long time, and then you open the door for something different, and it blows apart what everyone felt was the most competitive way of operating. Yeah. So what was the feedback? How did people respond to that, or did they not believe their eyes?
Well, I'd say it was surprising, probably because they didn't believe their eyes. But everyone has just embraced it. So right now we have 45 apprentices in the business. They're all, well, in fact, there's more than that, because there's a separate group. So I've probably got about 52 apprentices in the business. I had a meeting with all of them this week, and and what's surprising is how they're enjoying it, and actually the roles that they're getting to do. And surprisingly, those people across all parts of the business, whether it's editorial departments or my part of the business or other parts of the business and the radio side, everyone is loving what the apprentices are doing. So we've seen a real change anyway. But the interesting thing when we started this whole journey is how many people volunteered to help me try and change this organization. And I think what you find is that this is the latency. People are scared, and it's not just about ethnic people that may be scared to raise the voice. It was actually about Caucasian people that know it's not right, and want to volunteer and want to do something and help change. And that was the groundswell that I was surprised about initially.
Well, I think one of the most profound things to come out of the last 18 months is not just, are you racist, but are you anti-racist? Are you actively doing something to make a difference? And it's great to hear you had a real influx of people wanting to help and to support you, who are from a different background to yourself.
And that's well, look, I mean, we're an industry that, and I think I mentioned this to you the other week, is, if you take journalism as a whole, I've always said that the business need, you as a media organization, but as a media industry, we should be reflective of the people that we're all serving, and ultimately that is the wider society. And the wider society's makeup is fundamentally different to the makeup of not just our business, but of pretty much every media business in the UK. And there are, of all the journalists in the UK, 96 or just under 96, 95% are Caucasian. 5% from ethnic minority groups, but only 0.2% of journalists are black. That is a fundamental problem. When in London, 40% of the population in London is ethnically diverse, and in some parts of the country, whether it's Birmingham or Bradford, it's over 50%. So we have a problem in the, we're not reflecting that society. And my argument is, if you don't do something, you don't have a business. Not just us, but any other media company out there. So the drive really was about trying to bring apprentices in, trying to bring journalists in from different backgrounds that allow us to have a business in the years to come. Sure.
We've got 2 minutes left, and I would just like you to elaborate on how you were held accountable. I remember you telling this brief anecdote about staff earning over 150,000 are discussed at board level or at a very senior level, and I found that fascinating.
So we're but my argument is, as a business, you measure everything, don't you? Where if it's revenue, I'm measuring revenue every day. I'm measuring how many people read my website, how many people listen to my radio station, how many hours they listen for. So, and the business only works around targets. And if you don't have targets, then you don't have anything meaningful to aim for. So I present this back to the exec every month. This is what we're doing. This is how many ethnically diverse people we brought in, how many gender. And the key thing is where the execs absolutely play a role is on the level down from them. So the most senior managers, and I measure everywhere, there's the last 7 appointments that we made, and I take a package of 150 to 200,000 and above. So for that package, what do they look like? And it's really important that we understand that, because if we're not making change at that as an exec by employing people that are diverse, then how the hell do we expect everyone else to do it? And so that's why we pick on the senior management, and we're held to account on that. And we're actually all bonused on it as well as an exec team. But that isn't the real driver. It's that we also recognise that if we perpetuate it, it isn't going to change below.
Absolutely, it's the right thing to do, and ultimately, as you say, having a diverse business reflects the diversity of the audience you are servicing through your publications. Dominic, thank you very much for your time. I think you are a fantastic example of someone using their earned and unearned privilege to really drive change within their business. And I sincerely hope everybody listening has taken away a few points from this discussion they can apply within their own organizations. Thank you again, and have a good Friday.
Thanks a lot.